So welcome back everyone, and continuing in the spirit of feminist action across the sector, we have another winspirational treat in store as we're absolutely honoured to be joined by Dr Althea Greenan. Althea works in special collections and archives at Goldsmiths University of London, curating the Women's Art Library collection. Her work with the collection began in 1989 as a volunteer, continuing to today where she collaborates with artists, students and academic researchers to help realise new art and curatorial projects that develop alongside the collection. Althea has written extensively on the work of women artists, publishing reviews, interviews, creative pieces and more, including an article about Arliss upcoming for July 2024, which was the inspiration behind the invitation to join us here today. Althea's doctoral research recently focused on the Women's Art Library slide collection and aspects of digitisation, asking what an artist's slide collection can do beside represent artwork, and I believe we're shortly going to be gaining an insight or two into the answer. Althea's current activities also include the Animating Archives research project and the 2023 Exhibitions Hub Alumni Commission Award, partnering with Goldsmiths Art Department, and she's also on the advisory board of Feminist Art Making Histories. Althea, you're an inspiration, or rather winspiration to the women of Scotland's libraries. Thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
If I weren't so scared, the honor would be mine. But librarians are a pretty, empathetic crowd, if nothing else. So, I titled this Collections Gather Us, and as I was saying to Sarah Sheridan over lunch, I kind of thought of something that wouldn't be pinning me down too much as to what I was going to talk about. So we've got thoughts on a feminist custodianship. So bear with me. I think I'm just going to sort of take you on a little journey through the collection and some of the projects that the Women's Art Library has engendered, might be a pretty good word for that. So, just for the moment, I invite you to look at this projected image. It's a photograph of an artwork held in a 35mm mounted transparency or slide. The slide is labeled and identified as recording an artwork, but as you can see, the artist has also recorded her foot, wearing a thick white sock, stepping down on a sheet, making wrinkles that in their turn record the softness of a mattress. She has also recorded the traces of folds crossing her artwork that I assume is usually stored folded away. The instructions printed on the slide mount inform us that we are viewing the artwork from the correct side, but maybe it's actually telling us we're viewing the transparency from the correct side. But more importantly, Beth Higgins has inscribed this slide with the artwork's metadata. The photograph of the slide, as opposed to the photograph of the artwork, is a JPEG, another kind of assemblage of light and color that makes the slide legible and digitally preserves it in its entirety so that we can view it as an object made by the artist. It's an image that brings the artist into view. Not only can I feel the mattress shifting under her foot, I feel the annoyance of not being able to erase ink as I write. In looking at this image, I feel myself being brought into view, absorbed by the physical details revealing this artist so vividly engaged with the task of documenting her artwork. I think it's a miracle that such a slide survives in a slide collection today as part of a university library. Firstly, almost all teaching slide collections were consigned by their institutions to landfill back in the 2000s. And I usually have a fabulous picture of a slide shattered, sitting in a puddle that I came across as I left the back door of Goldsmiths Library one morning. Secondly, this slide is a terrible image in terms of representing an artwork. No gallery or publisher or art college admission office would have been impressed by an image that's so relaxed about the conventions of photographing art as this slide is. But here it is, serving a different kind of purpose, because the artist sent it to something called a Women Artist Slide Library. It has survived to represent something more than artwork. I look after a collection that began as a feminist project, conceived by a small group of British women artists, recognizing the importance of self-documentation as a means of raising the visibility of women artists. And this became, the Women Artist Slide Library became an alternative institution that welcomed the self-defined woman artist at any stage of her career that she was happy to document and share. So now we have Isik Tutsener and her museum. The Women's Art Library is a collection that was originally begun by women artists inspired by the women's movement of the 1970s. And it's a collection that has expanded from a slide library to include many forms of publishing and documentation beyond the photographic form. But I start, as those artists did, with the 35mm slide, because it was the tool of all artists using to record their work and showcasing their artwork to gain financial and critical recognition. And this is nice to show this image of Kim Valdez's slide because I showed this slide file to somebody researching Greenham Common artwork inspired by Greenham Common. The actual artwork got dug out of the shed at the bottom of the garden just a couple of years ago and became part of this exhibition at the Barbican this past year. Artists sent slides to the Women Art Slide Library, later called the Women's Art Library, to represent their art practice in a space open to a public looking for art images and to artists for anything from publications, exhibition projects, and scholarship to practical collaborations. Today, the collection persists in representing artists, but not in the straightforward way that a website showcase would. And of course, that's what artists would produce now. The slide collection appears to suspend these artworks in a remote history, but many artists are still active and having contributed to the slide library as students or emerging artists. And many of the slides represent young work and were submitted to the Women's Art Library because the library itself assigned value, not just to the documentation, but to the women as artists. As a feminist project, the library developed a strong representation of women's art practices that reflected their participation in social politics as well. Art documentation can be seen as rich evidence of the breadth of women's artistic methods of engaging with public life. And sending your slides to the Women's Artist Slide Library was a way of getting your work out of the studio and into the world. The world, of course, changed, and over the decades since it was set up, the technology for showcasing artists moved into digitized networks, but the importance of the public space is defined by being a library was safeguarded as integral to the identity of the organization. Developing as a library as well as a community meant relocating the material collection and workspaces, as you can see, several times around London, and I was there for every move. From its first public location in a small office in Battersea Arts Centre, the emphasis of the Women Artist Slide Library, or WASL, as we like to call it, was as much about promoting artists as it was about generating new knowledge about women's art practice. A network of community and exchange was fostered through publishing and distributing newsletters, making exhibitions, organizing conferences, and I'm standing here today as part of a continuum of advocacy first set up in this space at Battersea Arts Centre. The Wassel was one of many feminist initiatives organized as resource centers in London during this time, during the 70s, 80s, often supported by local councils. The Women's Committee of Hammersmith and Fulham was instrumental to the relocation to a more spacious suite of rooms here in Fulham Palace. Here in the Bishop's Library. We always said he would be turning in his grave if he only knew. The workspace office was expanded to hold press cuttings and ephemera artists' files, as well as the filing cabinets of slides. This was a workspace, and it welcomed visitors to create their own research resources. So we were also selling artist postcards, but alongside the most critical piece of equipment in this room is the photocopier, and we encouraged everybody to replicate material from the artist files, which is not something a conventional archive might encourage. In fact, all research was welcomed as a means of distributing knowledge, and reproducing documentation was so very much encouraged. The magazine collection, which is visible alongside the postcard displays in this photo, was built up from reciprocal subscriptions, because at this point the book collection took up just a few shelves as there was no budget to buy books. But the collection was growing as books were donated or sent to the editors of the Wassel Journal for review. So it was quite critical to be generating a publication at the same time as collecting material into an educational resource. Moving out of a palace into an art school seemed to be a natural progression. The library was welcomed by the wonderful librarians at Central St. Martin's when it moved there in 2000. But the Women's Art Library had become something else. It had become MAKE, the Organization for Women's Art. And the blurriness of this image captures, I think, the way the material collection, the actual library, had become distanced from its original mission. By 2000, the organization, by dropping this notion of this word library from its title, had become a different kind of feminist project. Concerned with the politics of institutional visibility and working to take a place in the increasingly global and commercially driven art world, the feminist emphasis on community building felt a bit passé. The connection with contemporary art practice had been taken over by the more visible and sexier looking magazine. The magazine provided a platform for a different kind of feminist advocacy, emphasizing analysis, showcasing excellence in scholarship, and leading debate, which all sounds very good. But as a way of validating your own art practice, the magazine felt increasingly inaccessible. There was a rift between the community representing themselves in the material collections and whose art world visibility was reproduced in the pages of the magazine in order to raise its profile. But by 2001, the funders came to view the magazine as redundant, and the last issue was published in 2002. Meanwhile, they worked with the organization to keep that material collection together and find it a new home. This view of filing cabinets holding the slide collection with the boxes on top, containing some of the paper artist files, would have been the view that the subject librarian of Goldsmiths for art and design at the time, Jacqueline Cook, would have contemplated when she came to visit the library in 2001. She was ascertaining the feasibility of it going to Goldsmiths to build up its special collections. As an art librarian, I am always aware that however many art books, magazines, slides, and videos I acquire for the library, more actions, events, and thoughts remain undocumented there. I won't read the whole thing out, but it's a beautiful quote. And it's from her thesis that she was writing at the time on ephemera, the importance of ephemera collections. The network of British feminist art academics who had contributed to the Women's Art magazine and helped build the library over the years helped secure the collection in a safe place. There were excellent bids from different universities, but the proposal from Goldsmiths was the only one that directly involved its librarians. When I read this passage from Jacqueline's doctoral thesis years later, I couldn't help but admire her sound and practical understanding of why the Women's Art Library was so valuable and how it would work in that institutional library in the future. The collection's been secured and significantly expands how students and staff can approach teaching and learning through artist documentation. It is a collection that stimulates awareness of how artists are situated within wider cultural spheres, beyond the educational setting, and who is represented in the main sequence in the art section upstairs. It's a collection that highlights artistic research and benefits from the fact that those who work in the arts are always researching. So there's a challenge inherent in the security that an institution offers. Becoming a special collection has meant that my custodianship has shifted from protecting and developing the collection to protecting the browsing experience that is so important to research. My day-to-day work is entirely shaped by my belief that the material of the Women's Art Library collection yields an extraordinary perspective on what constitutes a valuable art practice, and that when a researcher is enabled to browse materials, they gain a very useful, even empowering sense of where they are situated in the space of discourse. In a feminist ethics approach, archivists are seen as caregivers, bound to records creators, subjects, users, and communities through a web of mutual affective responsibility. My awareness of how the library had changed as a welcoming space was acute. I had worked with this collection since it occupied the open, office-like spaces of Fulham Palace, and I was responsible for moving it to Central St. Martin's and finally Goldsmiths. The move that deposited the collection into a library's special collections focused my custodianship very much on prioritizing the formation of affective relationships between researcher and these eloquent materials. I worked against the collection going dark and revived different ways for the collection to promote and support women practitioners. In return, the collection has developed in a surprising way at Goldsmiths, and we're all continuing to learn from it. I've come to understand from artists like Samia Malik, who co-founded the Women of Color Index Reading Group along with Rahanat Saran and Michelle Williams-Gamaker, that access defines a collection. They devised this reading group in the and picked up the work that the Women of Color Index had begun in the 1980s to carry it through to today. On the occasion of being awarded the 2018 Art in the Archive bursary that the Women's Art Library offers in partnership with the Feminist Review, the Women of Color Index Reading Group wrote, "This is a productive and vital opportunity to build on the foundations of the Woki Reading Group, which aims to make Black and Asian art history a compulsory part of art education. Fundamental to our work is to keep the artists in Woki visible and offer cross-generational dialogue so that rather than be confined to the archive, we can explore art practice from the past and how this intersects with the present and future of production and care for artists of color." And there is going to be a book about the Woki Reading Group. It's currently in production through Bookworks, which is being edited by Samia Malik, and interviews people who put together this reading group. So this is a still from a 30-minute film that was commissioned by Art 360. made by Holly Antrim, which is titled Yes to the Work, and it is about, originally it was going to be about me talking about the women artists, the Women's Art Library at Goldsmiths, and I said, I don't want to be the one always talking about this. Let's make a film, let's invite people back in who had already done a lot of work with the collection and make it a conversation. So this film is available on YouTube. And here's Gina Nembard saying that having the opportunity to go through your archive, she's addressing Rita Keegan, having the opportunity to go through your archive and the rest, it's like a two-way conversation. So here's Rita Keegan again. She was in that image in the Fulham Palace. Having returned to the Women's Art Library after decades of working on other projects, including her own art practice, her return is thanks to the artistic research group X Marks the Spot, whose approach to exploring the paper files and slide files of the Women of Color Index included a determination to make contact and record Rita as the index creator. Motivated by a sense of responsibility to the creator and today's community, X Marks the Spot produced the publication Human Endeavor, a creative finding aid for the Women of Color Index. And this book is also available on, as a PDF through Goldsmiths. And this is a double-page spread from inside. So this is a creative finding aid where you find the subject of the collection, not just the artists represented in the files dating from the mid-90s to mid-80s to mid-90s, but the subject as the creative British woman artist of color, still practicing, representing herself to her audience in 2015, which is when this book was put out. The finding aid is a gathering place, a theme recently explored at a two-day event organized by Tate Research at Tate Modern just this past weekend. And here's an artist page that's being kind of collected within the format of the book alongside reflective essays recontextualizing the content of the Women of Color Index. And when the group realized that Rita Keegan had her own archive that needed organizing and housing, they secured Heritage Lottery funding to produce an exhibition, which was held at the South London Gallery, a publication that was published by Goldsmiths Press, and I would have brought it up to hold it, but it's too big and heavy to lug up from London, and also an organized and boxed archive that's now been deposited in the Women's Art Library. This is Under the River. It's part of a series painted in 2018 by Gita Rupnarine, and it was made in the Special Collections and Archives Study Room at Goldsmiths. So the collection itself has become a desired space for women artists. There are many examples of artists responding to it in this way, as a place for desire, to the very idea of a collection dedicated to women only. I would say the most important way of enabling a creative encounter is giving the research space and time. The rules of a special collection study room of pencils only needed to be set aside for this, for Gita Rupnarine, who's usually a computational artist, so for her to bring gouaches in was quite a departure, but something she felt she needed to do. She was responding to the idea of what she felt was a river of women artists represented behind the wall of special collections in the cool of the stack. And I often take people through the door that says Artist in the Stack to have them experience the scale of the collections, but also that affective space. And I have had researchers write about the feel of sitting in that space with the collection and nothing else. Because of this painting's abstract quality and vivid color, I propose this as a powerful example of how the space of the Women's Art Library, harboring information on thousands of artists, also makes more room for the single artistic female voice. because of how it was collected. Gita had participated in a workshop weeks before that explored how displaying archives alongside contemporary reflections as text or images to bring artifacts into a dialogue with multiple voices and histories led her to come back into the space and to have her own kind of conversation with these artifacts. In this image, let's see. In this image, you see an example, one of the books that was donated from the estate of Helen Chadwick, who was a brilliant artist who died in 1996. Her archives are at the Henry Moore Foundation, but the book collection is transformative in a different sense, suggesting how the Women's Art Library collection is being enhanced by this important artist's personal research reading. Before we add the books into the library catalog, we've got the artist Miriam Sampaio, who is working across the collection with the project that she's calling she's in search of Helen and looking for evidence of Helen in her books. These books did not arrive in a particular sequence or with any other indication of their order of importance to the artist who had collected them. But Miriam is recording Chadwick's presence in her books by recording and scanning her annotations, her underlinings, her dedications, and this bookmarking with gold strips of gold paper that Chadwick did throughout, with a very sort of small section of the books. Miriam's approach to finding order in the book collection reflects her own art practice that involves deep dives into Portuguese archives to visualize her own family genealogy. But here, in the context of the Women's Art Library, we are looking or creating a kind of genealogy of women artists. So practicing the feminist shelf in the Women's Art Library is another way of describing how the collection's system of gathering information on artists makes space on the shelf to experience their achievement. I don't have everything that Hilary Robinson has ever published, but the space, in a sense, is reserved for her. The shelf can be read in terms of women's achievement and the way the collection includes artist publications, self-published, and homemade folders as well. All these kind of different forms of publication are a testament to how the collection gathers its subject, the woman artist, and her advocates. So talking about advocates and women artists, I've got to distribute these postcards.
Yes.
Because there's nothing worse than staying in that community. This is just for you. You can give them back. You don't feel embarrassed. So what I've done is I've handed out Hannah O'Shea, who's on the image. Here's in this image that I took to represent the slide library, introduce it to new audiences. When we first got to Goldsmiths and nobody knew it was there. So here, Hannah O'Shea is appearing as a shadowy figure in this slide that shows her performing the litany of women artists. This is a performance where she has a long script that is just a list of women artists through the ages, and she enunciates their names. It was recently reenacted at Tate Britain in the Duveen Gallery of the original Tate building, so in the heart of the gallery, to conjure and fill the museum with the names of women artists as part of the events marking the end of the Women in Revolt exhibition, which has just been transferred up to Edinburgh and is in the MoMA. So although this isn't the first time that Hannah O'Shea performed this piece at the Tate, I would say that last month's A Litany for Women Artists was not the reenactment of a historical art performance, but a necessary gathering of women artists into the establishment's cultural space. It seems that we need to be reminded of the true breadth of women's art practice, and naming instigating the process of recognition and even celebration. This tiny fragment of annotated text is from the score Claire Gasson devised from the Women's Art Library database of names. It represents the exhaustive detail that went into the enunciation of every name of every woman represented in some form in the Women's Art Library collection. It was performed at the South London Gallery in the Clore studio at the back. Each name was spoken, thousands of names coming together to produce a split rhythm spoken word performance, and that was also called The River. It took 8 vocalists around an hour to enunciate each name, and the performance was a mesmerizing collective experience of the power of collection itself. Back in the stack, the boxes of uncatalogued materials drew the artist Kiona Hagen Niehaus in to setting up a live stream between the stack and a gallery opening event to effectively catalog these unassigned pieces into her own virtual archive-making history of coming out as a young lesbian in Florida. And this was part of a project that she did with a curator, Brenda Ganay, called Cybernetic Resistance. And the events that this was being live streamed into was at the showroom, opening up an exhibition of archive material and setting up a cyber cafe. And that's what the projection looked like in the space in the showroom. The Women's Art Library is a collection that gathers its constituents in a fluid holding space, just as all libraries need to be, I've since discovered, where the collections themselves undergo weeding and other reconfigurations due to the possibilities of experiencing collections through digital networking. And so everything is changing because we have this possibility of the collections being expanded into digital networks. But I found another kind of consistency has been brought out about the materials in the Women's Art Library itself. I'm bound not just by the stuff itself, but by the way my responsibility for it is underpinned by a sense that all these materials have been gifted. Many artists are surprised, sometimes embarrassed, but also reassured when they realize that the slides they deposited in the 1980s continue to be looked after, often as the only records of artworks that have since been lost. I like the way I'm pictured here by the artist Amelia Beavis Harrison as a figure out of time, taking up my standing space in the continuum of this unique art library. But I'm wary of being over-identified with the Women's Art Library now. Advocacy can look as if there's just one person, one expert put on the stage, in front of the microphone, to do the work. But I feel very far from being an expert or a supernaturally gifted priestess of the slides. Just like the researchers whose work is shaped by what they find in the Women's Art Library, my advocacy is shaped by the feminist work of the way this collection acts as the caregiver bound to its records creators, her artist subjects, her growing users, and our communities through a web of mutual affective responsibility. I'm privileged to witness how the Women's Art Library facilitates researchers turn to collective and intergenerational conversations about how we value our art practices and our histories through collecting and sharing. My last slide was taken last weekend, as once again I watched and listened to Rita Keegan demonstrating the importance of looking after art practices by paying attention to the materials we save. As she unpacked a box from her own archive, Rita spun out her narrative as Lauren Craig simultaneously preserved and shared each item with the audience by scanning them to create a digital archive projected onto a screen behind her. But periodically, Lauren would interrupt the chore of scanning. She'd take over the microphone and read out poetic reflections on the demands of archive work with its deeply felt connective power. Handing back to Rita, who picked up her anecdote from where she left off, the digital files continued to accumulate, but Lauren's commentary would hang in the air, reflecting the inner thoughts of many a collection worker. If there's a way to define what feminist custodianship looks like, I suggest it is whatever sustains this critical ability to see ourselves as continuous discoveries in the collections we work with. That's it.
Back your power via the feminist shelf. We love it, and it's so moving to see a collection and its evolution becoming so much deeper, so much richer than a simple showcase, and really, as you say, welcoming and actually facilitating that self-definition as a creative. It's incredible. Thank you so much. I believe we're very nearly out of time, but if anyone has a pressing question, please do give us a quick wave. Otherwise, Althea will be here for a few minutes afterwards. And then I believe I'm handing back to Sean, or as he comes down the aisle, just for a few notes as we wrap up, and then head towards dinner later on. But thank you, everybody, and can we just all come together again to thank Althea so much for those insights.
Thank you, Althea, that was wonderful. Yeah, it's a beautiful sunny day, it's nearly 4:30, I'm not going to keep you any longer, just to say a quick thank you to all our speakers, all our keynotes, all our parallels, all our exhibitors and all our delegates. It's been a wonderful day with lots and lots of different content, and it's certainly been inspiring for me, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. If you are coming for dinner tonight, then it's 7 o'clock, just meet down in the bar and we'll be in the exhibition room. If you're not coming back after now, then thank you so much for joining us. We'll send out a feedback form, and just safe travels home on your journey back. But everyone else that's staying here, please do look forward to dinner, but between now and then, go and relax, and we'll see you later on. So thanks again, and see you soon. Thank you.